My name is Arthur Wells. For the better part of 2 decades, I served as a senior archivist for a modest university library, a role I found deeply satisfying. My days were spent amidst the quiet rustle of turning pages and the unique, dry scent of aging paper, a sanctuary of order and accumulated knowledge. I have always been a man of quiet habits, preferring the meticulous organization of facts and histories to the often chaotic interactions of the wider world. The decision to seek employment as a fire lookout was, therefore, somewhat out of character, yet it stemmed from a profound need for an even deeper solitude. The recent passing of my mother, herself a woman of reclusive tendencies, had left me with a small inheritance and an even larger silence in my life. The relentless thrum of the city, once a background hum, had become an irritant, and the prospect of a season spent in the remote wilderness, surrounded by nothing but trees and sky, held an undeniable, almost medicinal allure. I imagined it as a period of quiet contemplation, a balm for a mind weary of noise and the subtle complexities of grief. The journey to Blackwood Peak Lookout was an exercise in progressive isolation. It began on a state highway, then devolved to a winding county road, its asphalt cracked and patched. This, in turn, gave way to a gravel track that rattled the old Forest Service pickup. Truck Henderson, the district ranger, was driving. Henderson was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, and he seemed to regard my city-bred quietness with a sort of wary acceptance. Finally, the gravel surrendered to a rutted dirt path barely wide enough for the vehicle, clawing its way up the mountainside. The last mile, Henderson informed me with a grunt, was on foot. He left me at a small, sun-dappled clearing with my modest rucksack and a final, appraising look. "She's all yours," he'd said, gesturing vaguely upwards with his chin before retreating in the rattling truck, the sound of its engine slowly fading until it was swallowed entirely by the vast, indifferent silence of the forest. The tower itself, when I finally reached it after a steep, breath-stealing climb, was an impressive, if somewhat unsettling, structure. It was an older model, all steel girders and weathered wood. Perhaps an Aeromotor MC-39 or something similar from that era, perched on the very apex of Blackwood Peak like a skeletal raptor. It rose a good 60 feet from its concrete footing, a narrow, enclosed cabin at its summit, surrounded by a railed catwalk. The view was, as promised, panoramic. An endless, undulating ocean of green stretched in every direction. The distant peaks of other mountains, hazy blue against the horizon. It was beautiful, certainly, but also profoundly daunting. There was a palpable sense of being utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant speck on this mountaintop fortress, as the previous lookout had apparently called it in the logbook. Henderson had mentioned him briefly, a young man, eager at first, who had left in a bit of a hurry, his contract unfulfilled. Didn't take to the quiet, I suppose, Henderson had mused, though his tone suggested there might have been more to it. The cabin was Spartan but functional. A built-in bunk, a small wood burning stove, a desk bolted to the floor, and the all-important Osborne fire finder. Its brass, gleaming dully, in the afternoon light. After stowing my gear, a selection of books I deemed suitably contemplative, a sturdy thermos and practical, if unexciting, outdoor clothing, I began a more thorough inspection. It was then tacked neatly to the back of the cabin door with 4 tarnished thumbtacks that I found it. A single sheet of thick, slightly yellowed paper, protected by a surprisingly robust laminate. Typed neatly across the top was the heading, "The Blackwood Peak Lookout Official Regulations," and conduct. My eyebrows rose. Henderson had given me the standard Forest Service manual, a hefty tome detailing everything from radio protocols to wildfire suppression techniques. This, however, was something else entirely. I unpinned it and read one. Never acknowledge the whistling you hear after sunset. It is not the wind. 2. The western window shutter must remain bolted from dusk until dawn. No exceptions. 3. If the radio broadcasts a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., turn it off immediately. Do not listen to the end. Under no circumstances attempt to identify the source. 4. You may see a single light moving through the trees far below, especially on moonless nights. Do not report it. It is not a lost hiker. Do not attempt to signal it. 5. Should you find any carvings or symbols etched into the tower structure that were not there previously, report their appearance and exact location in the logbook. Do not touch them. 6. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor to the catwalk after midnight, ignore it. You are alone. 7. Food supplies are to be stored in the provided metal containers only. Ensure they are sealed tightly each night. This is not solely for rodent prevention. If you wake to find all your books rearranged on the shelves, leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. Do not attempt to put them back in order until you return. 9. The old generator may sometimes run erratically. However, if it stops completely during a clear night with no wind, do not attempt to restart it until sunrise. 10. Do not speak of what you see or hear during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listen. I read the list twice, a faint smile playing on my lips. It was, I concluded, a rather elaborate piece of hazing for the new man. Or perhaps the literary efforts of a predecessor whose solitude had frayed the edges of his sanity. The almost bureaucratic presentation, the lamination, the neat typing, only added to the absurdity. Rodent prevention, indeed. I was a man of logic, an archivist. My concerns were with verifiable facts, with the documented procedures in the official manual. I pinned the list back onto the door, a curious relic of someone else's anxieties, and turned my attention to the more pressing matters of settling in. The first night descended with an almost theatrical grandeur. The sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky before sinking behind the distant ranges, and the stars emerged with a brilliance I hadn't witnessed in decades, undimmed by city haze. The silence was profound, a living entity that pressed in from all sides. I made a few entries in the official logbook, familiarized myself with the radio call signs, and read a chapter of Marcus Aurelius by the light of a kerosene lamp. The generator, a temperamental beast according to Henderson, I decided to save for when truly necessary. As the hours deepened, I found myself listening more intently than usual. The wind, a constant presence at this altitude, sighed and moaned around the cabin, occasionally rattling a loose pane of glass in its frame. Once, I thought I heard a faint, high-pitched sound, a thin thread of noise that seemed to weave through the deeper tones of the wind. Rule 1 flickered at the edge of my memory. It is not the wind. I dismissed it. An animal, perhaps, or merely the tower settling? Its steel contracting in the cooling air. Such structures were known for their peculiar acoustics. Later, as I was drifting towards sleep on the narrow bunk, the radio crackled. A burst of static, sharp and sudden. My eyes snapped open. It was just shy of 300 a.m. Rule 3, a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. I held my breath, listening. More static, then silence. Just interference, I told myself, common in these remote, mountainous regions. Still, a faint prickle of unease traced its way down my spine, an unwelcome sensation I attributed to fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. Just before I finally succumbed to sleep, I was looking out the eastern window, towards the pale wash of the pre-dawn sky. At the very periphery of my vision, something seemed to flicker among the dark, unmoving shapes of the trees far below. A brief, indistinct movement. When I turned my head to focus, there was nothing but the impenetrable blackness of the forest. An optical illusion, I reasoned. A trick of tired eyes in the low light. The mind, especially one accustomed to the constant stimulus of urban life, could play strange games when confronted with such profound sensory stillness. The previous lookout, I mused, had likely fallen prey to such imaginings, his isolation breeding phantoms from the mundane. I resolved then to be more disciplined, to not allow the vast emptiness to populate itself with unwarranted fears. I was Arthur Wells, a man of reason. And reason, I was certain, would prevail. The following days settled into a peculiar rhythm, a blend of the mundane tasks of a lookout and the subtle, persistent hum of the unexplained that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of Blackwood Peak. I diligently performed my duties. Regular sweeps of the horizon with the binoculars, meticulous recording of weather patterns, wind speed, direction, temperature, cloud cover, and the obligatory radio check. Ends with Henderson, whose gruff voice was a strangely comforting, if distant, link to the ordinary world. I spent a good deal of time studying the topographical maps, familiarizing myself with the names of distant ridges, valleys, and the intricate network of creeks that spiderwebbed across the vast green expanse. This was, after all, my primary function, the reason for my presence here. Yet, the official regulations and conduct list, still tacked to the door, exerted a subtle influence, a kind of cognitive itch. I found my gaze drawn to it more often than I cared to admit. Each rule, initially dismissed as a prank or the ramblings of a disturbed mind, began to take on a more insidious quality as small, inexplicable events chipped away at my determined rationalism. The whistling, for instance. Rule 1T. Never acknowledge the whistling you hear after sunset. It is not the wind. It returned the second night, and the third. It was not the mournful sigh of wind through the steel girders of the tower, nor the rustle of air through the dense pine needles. This was a distinct, almost melodic sound, yet utterly devoid of warmth or human intention. It seemed to drift from the deep woods to the north, a series of rising and falling notes that were too patterned, too deliberate, to be a natural phenomenon. The first time I heard it clearly, a shiver traced its way down my spine, despite the residual warmth from the small wood stove. I found myself consciously turning my attention elsewhere, focusing intently on a passage. In Seneca, the Stoic philosophy, a deliberate counterpoint to the unsettling sound. I did not acknowledge it, just as the rule dictated, but the effort of not acknowledging it was, in itself, a form of acknowledgement. The western window shutter, Rule 20. The western window shutter must remain closed and bolted from dusk until dawn. No exceptions. Became a focal point of a strange, self-imposed vigilance. It was a heavy wooden shutter, reinforced with iron bands and secured from the inside by two thick bolts. Each evening as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I would ensure those bolts were firmly in place. There was no logical reason for this particular window to be singled out. All the windows were of similar construction, offering similar views. Yet, the specificity of the rule gnawed at me. One evening, driven by a perverse curiosity I immediately regretted, I delayed bolting it by a mere 10 minutes past dusk. Nothing happened. The forest outside remained dark and silent, save for the usual nocturnal chorus of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. And yet, when I finally slid the bolts home, the sense of relief was disproportionate, almost shameful. It was as if, by obeying the arbitrary instruction, I had narrowly averted some unseen, unspecified consequence. The radio, Rule 3. If the radio broadcasts a children's song between 300 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., turn it off immediately. Do not listen to the end. Under no circumstances attempt to identify this. Remained silent during those proscribed early morning hours for several nights. After the initial burst of static, I found myself waking instinctively a few minutes before 3000 a.m., a knot of anxiety in my stomach, listening to the faint hiss of the receiver. The silence was almost worse than the static had been. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with a possibility I was trying to deny. I told myself it was the power of suggestion, the list planting seeds of unease. In my mind, my subconscious fabricating these anxieties from the thin air of solitude, the single light in the trees. Rule 40. You may see a single light moving through the trees far below, especially on moonless nights. Do not report it. It is not a lost hiker. Do not attempt to signal it. Did appear. It was on the fourth night, a night of inky blackness, with no moon to silver the landscape. I was on the catwalk, taking in the cool night air, the vastness of the starry sky a dizzying spectacle. Then I saw it, a small, steady yellow light, like a lantern, moving slowly and deliberately through the dense forest on the lower slope of the eastern ridge. My first instinct, the ingrained response of any responsible lookout, was to grab the binoculars to try and ascertain its nature. A lost hiker, poachers, but the rule, stark and unequivocal, flashed in my mind. It is not a lost hiker. I watched it for several minutes, a cold dread creeping into me. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, not bobbing or wavering, as a handheld lantern would. It simply glided, a solitary spark in the immense darkness, before disappearing behind a thick stand of firs. I did not report it. I did not signal it. I retreated into the cabin, the image of that silent, purposeful light burning in my memory. The carvings, Rule 5e. Should you find any carvings or symbols etched into the tower structure that were not there previously, report their appearance and exact location in the logbook. Do not touch them. They were perhaps the most overtly unsettling development. On the morning of the 5th day, as I was conducting my routine inspection of the tower's exterior, I found one. It was on the steel support beam of the northeast leg, about 10 feet from the ground, a crude, spiral symbol, about the size of my palm, freshly gouged into the metal. It hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of it. My archival training had instilled in me a keen eye for detail, for changes in the state of objects. This was new. The metal around the edges of the carving was bright, almost gleaming where the weathered paint and rust had been scraped away. It was not a symbol I recognized from any known iconography, though it had a vaguely unsettling, organic quality to it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I meticulously recorded its appearance and location in the official logbook, as instructed. My hand surprisingly unsteady. New carving NE support approx. Tef from base, spiral pattern. I wrote, the words looking stark and inadequate on the page. I resisted the urge to touch it, the cold metal seeming to radiate a faint, almost imperceptible wrongness. The knocking Rule 6c. If you hear knocking on the trapdoor to the catwalk after midnight, ignore it. You are alone. Began on the 6th night. I was reading. The silence of the cabin, broken only by the rhythmic tick of my watch and the occasional creak of the tower settling. It was well past midnight. Then a distinct, deliberate thump, thump, thump from directly above me, on the trapdoor that provided access to the catwalk from within the cabin. My blood ran cold. I froze, the book slipping from my fingers. You are alone. The words from the list echoed in my mind, a chilling affirmation. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Thump, THUMP, thump. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like knuckles on wood, a human sound. Yet there was no one else for miles, a fact Henderson had repeatedly, if indirectly, emphasized. My breath hitched in my throat. I sat there, rigid, for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending screaming. I did not move. I did not make a sound. Eventually, the knocking ceased, leaving a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat at the desk, the kerosene lamp casting flickering shadows, till the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the eastern window. My carefully constructed edifice of logic was beginning to crumble. These were not isolated incidents easily dismissed. They were a pattern, a series of occurrences that directly corresponded to that bizarre list on the door. The previous lookout, the young man who had left in a bit of a hurry. His departure suddenly seemed less about an aversion to quiet and more about an encounter with something else. The solitude I had craved was transforming, the silence no longer peaceful, but filled with an expectant, predatory quality. I found myself jumping at sudden noises, my senses on high alert, the familiar comfort of my books offering less and less solace. The wilderness, once a symbol of contemplative retreat, now felt vast, ancient, and indifferent to my civilized sensibilities, perhaps even actively hostile. The thought that I was merely a temporary, unwelcome intrusion in a place with its own ancient, unknowable rules was beginning to take root in my mind, a seed of primal fear. And the season had only just begun. The 7th day at Blackwood Peak. Lookout dawned gray and oppressive. The sky a bruised blanket that mirrored the growing turmoil within me. My meticulously kept logbook, once a testament to my orderly mind, now contained entries that seemed to belong to a different man, a man teetering on the edge of an abyss I had never known existed. The neat, precise script of my early days had become slightly more erratic, the ink sometimes smudged as if by a trembling hand. Sleep was a scarce commodity, snatched in brief, anxious bursts, and the solitude I had once romanticized now felt like a suffocating shroud. Rule 7. Regarding the food containers, food supplies are to be stored in the provided metal containers only. Ensure they are sealed tightly each night. This is not solely for rodent prevention. Had taken on a new, sinister dimension. I had, of course, followed it diligently from the start. They were standard Forest Service issue. Heavy, gauge steel with tight, fitting lids and sturdy latches. Rodents, even bears, would have found them a challenge. Yet, on the morning of the 7th day, I found the container, holding my supply of dried beans and rice subtly disturbed. The latches were still fastened, but the lid was slightly askew, as if something had tried, with considerable force, to pry it open from one side, then given up. There were no claw marks, no teeth marks. Just a faint indentation along the rim where some immense pressure had been applied. More unsettling were the faint, almost greasy fingerprints, or what looked like fingerprints, though they were too long, too thin, smudged on the dusty metal. I felt a wave of nausea. This was no animal. The phrase, not solely for rodent prevention, echoed with chilling understatement. I checked the other containers. They were untouched. But the message was clear: something new, where my sustenance was, and it was capable of interacting with my environment in a disturbingly intelligent way. That afternoon, the generators, Rule 90. The old generator may sometimes run erratically. However, if it stops completely during a clear night with no wind, do not attempt to restart it until sunrise. Decided to test my resolve. The day had remained unnervingly still, the air heavy and stagnant, not a breath of wind stirring the pines. The sky, though overcast, showed no sign of an impending storm. I had switched on the generator for an hour to recharge the radio battery and my small reading lamp. It chugged along with its usual cacophony for about 40 minutes, then, with a sputtering cough, fell silent. The sudden absence of its roar was deafening, amplifying the oppressive stillness of the forest. I checked the fuel ample. I checked the connections secure. There was no discernible reason for it to stop. The conditions of the rule were perfectly met. A clear, though overcast, not stormy day, no wind, and a complete cessation of function. The urge to tinker with it, to coax it back to life, was strong. It was a mechanical problem, surely, something a logical mind could diagnose and fix. But the rule, and the growing catalog of inexplicable events, stayed my hand. I left it, a silent, inert lump of metal, and the cabin felt darker, more vulnerable, without its potential for light and communication. The most profound violation of my personal space, however, came that night, or rather, in the small hours of the morning. Rule 8. If you wake to find all your books rearranged on the shelves, leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. Do not attempt to put them back in order until you return. My books, they were my companions, my link to the world of reason and intellect I felt slipping away. I had arranged them meticulously on the small, built-in shelf. Philosophy, history, a few volumes of classic literature. I awoke with a start, a sense of profound unease washing over me, even before my eyes focused. The kerosene lamp, which I now left burning low all night, cast a feeble, flickering glow. And there they were, my books. Every single one had been pulled from the shelf and stacked in a haphazard, teetering tower in the center of the small cabin floor. Not just rearranged, but desecrated, their order violated in a way that felt deeply personal, almost mocking. A cold fury mixed with a primal fear coursed through me. This was not a subtle creak or a distant sound. This was a direct, tangible act within my sanctuary. My first instinct was to rush forward, to restore order, to reclaim that small piece of my sanity. But the rule, stark and absolute, held me back. Leave the cabin for 1 hour, regardless of the weather. The wind had picked up, howling around the tower now, and a thin, icy rain had begun to fall, lashing against the windows. To go out onto that exposed catwalk, 60 feet above the ground, in this weather, in the dead of night, was madness. Yet, the alternative, to defy the rule, to remain in the cabin with whatever entity had demonstrated such intimate access to my space, felt even more dangerous. My hands trembled as I pulled on my boots and raincoat. The metal of the trapdoor handle was cold, shockingly so. Stepping out onto the catwalk was like stepping into another world, a realm of shrieking wind and stinging rain. The narrow walkway offered little protection. I clung to the railing, the steel vibrating with the force of the gale, and made my slow, terrifying circuit of the cabin. The forest below was a black, roaring abyss. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching presence. Every gust of wind felt like an icy breath on my neck. The hours stretched into an eternity. I was exposed, vulnerable, a tiny, insignificant figure pitted against the vast, indifferent power of the storm, and whatever unseen things inhabited this peak. The fear was a living thing, coiling in my gut, constricting my chest. Was this the point? To drive me out, to test my obedience, to show me how utterly powerless I was? When the hour was finally, agonizingly up, I timed it on my watch. its luminous dial a small beacon of order in the chaos. I practically fell back into the cabin, soaked, shivering, and utterly demoralized. The tower of books still stood in the center of the floor. I waited until the first hint of gray dawn touched the eastern sky before I dared to touch them. My hands still shaking as I restored them to their proper places on the shelf. But they no longer felt like my companions. They felt like objects that had been touched, tainted, by something alien and unknowable. My attempts to communicate, my growing unease to Henderson during our scheduled radio check-ins were met with a frustratingly laconic dismissal. Rule 10's do not speak of what you see or during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listen was a constant, nagging deterrent. How could I even begin to explain the whistling, the light, the carvings, the knocking, the rearranged books, without sounding like I had succumbed to cabin fever? I tried to be subtle. Conditions up here are a bit unusual, Henderson, I'd said one morning, my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, how so, Wells?" he'd replied, his tone flat. "Just. The quiet seems to have a peculiar quality to it some nights." A pause, then Henderson's dry chuckle. "It's a quiet place, Wells. That's the point. See any smoke, you let me know. Otherwise, enjoy the peace." Enjoy the peace. The irony was a bitter pill. The peace was a lie. The silence was a canvas upon which my deepest fears, and perhaps something far more real, were painting a terrifying masterpiece. I began to study the old logbooks, left by previous lookouts with a new intensity. Most entries were mundane weather reports, sightings of deer or elk, notes on maintenance. But then, tucked into the back of a logbook from a prior, I found a series of entries from a lookout named Thomas Ashton. His handwriting, initially neat, grew increasingly agitated. He mentioned unsettling sounds, a feeling of being watched, and, most chillingly, the rules don't make sense until they start to apply to you. His last entry was a single, scrawled sentence. "It knows I'm here. It knows my name." After that, the logbook pages were blank for several weeks, until a new lookout began making entries, noting that the previous occupant had departed unexpectedly. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Ashton hadn't just left. He had fled. And whatever he had fled from was still here, with me. The list of rules was not a prank. It was a survival guide, a set of arcane protocols for coexisting with something ancient and malevolent that considered Blackwood Peak its domain. And I, Arthur Wells, the archivist, the man of logic, was now a character in a story far older and more terrifying than any I had ever catalogued. The question was no longer whether I could rationalize these events, but whether I could survive them. The deep hours of the night, once a time for quiet contemplation, were now a period of heightened vigilance, of listening for the whistle, for the knock, for the subtle signs that the rules were about to be enforced. And the thought that some things listen was a constant, paralyzing presence in the back of my mind. The discovery of Thomas Ashton's fragmented, terrified entries in the old logbook marked a turning point. My carefully constructed skepticism had been eroded, replaced by a gnawing dread. The rules were not a prank. They were a litany of warnings. A desperate attempt by those who had come before to codify the terrors of Blackwood Peak. Each rule now felt like a scar, a testament to some past horror. The official regulations and conduct sheet, once an object of mild amusement, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a constant reminder of the precariousness of my situation. The following nights were a blur of heightened anxiety and fractured sleep. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind, every rustle in the surrounding forest sent jolts of adrenaline through me. I found myself obsessively checking the bolts on the western shutter, my gaze constantly darting to the trapdoor, my ears straining for the first hint of the whistling or the dreaded knocking. The silence between these events was almost worse, filled with a suffocating anticipation. My books, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock me with their ordered rationality in the face of such primal, inexplicable fear. Rule 10. Do not speak of what you see or hear during the deep hours of the night to anyone over the radio, unless it is a confirmed fire. Some things listened became the most insidious of all. It isolated me completely, trapping me in a solitary confinement of terror. When Henderson's voice crackled over the radio for the routine check-ins, I would report, "Al quiet," my voice a hollow echo of the truth. How could I articulate the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes? The chilling certainty that the rearranged books were a deliberate, intelligent act of intimidation, or the unnatural smoothness of the light moving through the trees. He would think I was losing my mind. Another city dweller succumbing to the pressures of isolation. And perhaps I was. The line between the real and the imagined was becoming increasingly blurred. One particularly brutal night, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the tower with such violence, I feared it might be torn from its moorings. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the entire structure groaned and swayed. Sleep was out of the question. I sat at the desk, the kerosene lamp casting wild, dancing shadows. My knuckles white as I gripped a heavy iron skillet, the closest thing I had to a weapon. Around 200 a.m. Amidst the storm's fury, I heard it, a sound that chilled me to the bone, despite the stove's warmth. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, seemingly coming from inside the walls of the cabin. Not the frantic scrabbling of an animal, but a deliberate, methodical sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. It moved, circumnavigating the small room, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, a horrifying accompaniment to the storm outside. I pressed myself against the far wall, skillet held aloft, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was 60 feet in the air, in a metal cage, surrounded by an elemental fury and something else. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, a relentless torment that frayed my already tattered nerves. I didn't dare investigate. I simply endured, a prisoner of my fear. The next morning, exhausted and hollow-eyed, I found new carvings on the inside of the cabin door, just below the laminated list of rules. They were smaller than the one on the tower leg, more intricate, a series of jagged, interlocking lines that seemed to form a grotesque, unblinking eye. My stomach churned. It had been inside with me, or at least something capable of marking the interior of my sanctuary while I cowered mere feet away. The logbook entry for that day was brief. My handwriting barely legible. Severe storm. Unusual noises. New carvings on door interior. It was the radio incident, however, that truly pushed me to the brink. It happened on a still, moonless night. The kind where the silence of the forest felt absolute and watchful. I had actually managed to drift into a light, uneasy sleep when the radio crackled to life. My eyes snapped open. The luminous dial of my watch read 3:07 a.m. Rule 3. A children's song. But it wasn't a song. It was a voice. A child's voice, distorted and filled with a chilling, artificial sweetness. "Arthur." It whispered, the sound seeming to come from inches away, though the radio was across the room. "Arthur, let me in. It's cold out here." My blood turned to ice. It knew my name. Thomas Ashton's final, scrawled entry flashed in my mind. It knows my name. This wasn't random. This was personal. The voice was soft, pleading, yet utterly devoid of genuine emotion. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. "I'm lost, Arthur." The voice continued. A faint, almost inaudible sobbing sound in the background. "Please, just open the door. I'm so alone." My hand shot out and slammed the power switch on the radio, plunging the cabin back into silence. But the voice lingered in my ears, a venomous echo. I sat bolt upright in my bunk, trembling uncontrollably. This was no longer about strange occurrences or unsettling noises. This was a direct, targeted assault. The rules were not just guidelines. They were the only flimsy barrier between me and whatever this entity was. I knew then that I couldn't stay. My carefully constructed solitude had become a torture chamber. The peace I had sought was a monstrous illusion. The inheritance from my mother, the desire for quiet contemplation, it all seemed like a distant, naive dream. The only thing that mattered now was survival. The next morning, at first light, I began to pack. My movements were hurried, frantic. I didn't care about fulfilling my contract. I didn't care about Henderson's reaction. I threw my few belongings into my rucksack, my eyes constantly darting to the windows, to the trapdoor, expecting at any moment some new horror to manifest. The list of rules on the door seemed to mock me with its calm, typed instructions. As I was about to descend the tower for the last time, my gaze fell upon the official logbook. With a shaking hand, I opened it to a fresh page. I paused, then wrote, "To whoever finds this, the rules are real. Follow them. Do not try to understand. Do not try to rationalize. Just obey. Your sanity, perhaps your life, depends on it. It knows." I didn't sign my name. The journey down the mountain was a paranoid flight. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustling leaf sounded like approaching footsteps. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing where Henderson had left me, what felt like a lifetime ago. The hike to the gravel road, and then to the county road, was fueled by a desperate, primal urge to escape. I didn't look back. I never told anyone the full story of what happened at Blackwood Peak Lookout. Who would believe me? They would say it was stress, isolation, an overactive imagination. But I know what I experienced. I know the cold dread that settled in my soul, the certainty of a malevolent presence. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my city apartment, I think I can hear a faint, high-pitched whistling. And sometimes, when I'm on the edge of sleep, I hear a child's voice whispering my name. The Blackwood Peak Lookout still stands, I assume, waiting for its next occupant. And the list of rules, I have no doubt, is still tacked to the door, a silent, chilling invitation to a world where logic holds no sway, and the deep hours of the night belong to things that listen,